Well, hello there everyone! The Legend of Heroes Trails Through Daybreak is one of the entries in the very long-running Trails series and is my personal favorite entry of the lot, at least of the 9 or so games I've played in it. The story is well written, the characters are great, the music is awesome, and the gameplay was massively overhauled to take on a hybrid combat system of swapping between both action and turn-based RPG combat. And while I love the East series, I wanted to at least talk about its sister series in some way, and honestly, I'm not quite crazy enough to do a full video of an 80-hour JRPG yet, but I am very much crazy enough to do a boss ranking for it. Now, in the early 2020s, Falcom finally got themselves a new engine and a bit of an animation budget and decided to run with it, and they've been running with it ever since, as they made an awesome game. That being said, for this video, I'm only looking at the significant bosses because there's a lot of random fodder side bosses for side quests and things like that, and we're still looking at 29 boss fights. Jesus Christ, why do I do this to myself? Unfortunately, this game wasn't quite confident in its hybrid combat system, so all the boss fights are turn-based, but they're still fun, and if I can make a boss ranking for Metaphor ReFantasio and 7th Dragon 2020, I can make a ranking for this game. I should also mention this footage is recorded on normal or hard mode, depending, but I have beaten the game on Nightmare mode and will make references to those fights from time to time, for better or for worse. I'm also not going to be dividing the bosses into a bunch of super distinct tiers for this list because I don't really feel the need to. Instead, I'll just kind of point out where the bosses go from bosses I don't like, bosses I'm okay with, and the bosses I like. Anyways, that's enough rambling. Let's get on with the video and on with the ranking. Number 29, Alexander. If I was still doing tiers for this list, this guy would firmly be in the garbage bin. Alexander was the bane of my existence in my Nightmare mode playthrough for one specific reason, and that is Diamond Shield. He can pull this attack out whenever he damn well pleases, guaranteed to stop at least 3 attacks no matter what, and when you break it, he might just throw it up again. It doesn't matter if you're hitting him with a basic attack or an S-Craft, it's only going to take 1 notch off the shield, and he can keep doing it. This is a boss that can stall you out and take forever, and, it's just not fun. Yes, he has other mechanics, but I don't care. The only thing you're going to really remember is the Diamond Shield, and the fact that he has 200,000 HP, which is not an insignificant amount of health at this point in the game. It's actually very high as a matter of fact, and because it's an in-game Trails boss, he also has a burst mode, which buffs all of his stats and raises his HP by 10%. Most bosses, this isn't really a big deal because they only use it once or maybe twice, or in Ariok's case, he's kind of built around him going into that burst mode and spending a lot of time in that form, and you have to find a way around it. But with Alexander, since he can just keep stalling you out with Diamond Shield, this also leads to him having more time to just keep going back into burst mode, which leads to just a dreadful fight on Nightmare, and it just takes forever. I don't like it, it's not fun, it's easily the low point of the playthrough. Number 28, Alexander and Viola. His first fight basically has the exact same problems that his last fight does with Diamond Shield spam over and over again, but thankfully he doesn't really have the ability to go into burst mode constantly, so he's not healing it off, and he bails out at half HP, so you're only working through about 20,000 health instead of 200,000. On top of that, I do have to give him at least some points, because he's the first boss you'll likely see use an S-Craft against you, so that's kind of cool, if nothing else. Viola's here too, but I'll talk more about her fight when we get to her entry on this list, which won't be too long from now. Number 27, Hydra Nubia. This boss feels like he just misses the point of this game's combat system. He looks pretty cool, but he's a static monster that's at the edge of an arena, which ultimately means you're just going to be running up to him and whacking him. Positioning is a key factor in a lot of this game's boss fights and combat, and a lot of the attacks have extra damage or bonus effects if you use them from different angles, such as the side or from behind, so having a boss that you can only smack from the front really doesn't work too well, and your piercing attacks just don't work either because there's no area behind him. Combine that with a boss that loves to summon out enemies to pad out the fight, and yeah, I don't like him very much. Chapter 3 is weird because it has some of my favorite quests, some of the game's best writing, it introduces my favorite party member, Rosette, and it's where the main antagonist properly reveals himself. But it's got by far the worst batch of bosses. In fact, let's talk about another boss from Chapter 3, shall we? Number 26, Rayzamber Oka. Unfortunately, the boss immediately following the Hydra Nubia isn't doing much better. In fact, it might actually be doing worse because it's a bigger pain in the ass to deal with, but at least it's using the game's mechanics, so I'm putting him a bit higher. I want to love the big Shogun mech because mechs are objectively awesome, but the problem is this boss is just too damn hard. Now, on Nightmare mode, there's another boss I'd consider harder, but on a regular playthrough, this guy is actually probably the hardest boss in the game for no good reason. I will give a positive, the boss looks really awesome, and Fee joins your party for this fight, and you know, Fee's a fan favorite character for a reason, she's cool. However, this boss fight sucks with him being extremely aggressive, doing a ton of damage, being able to one-shot party members, sometimes multiple in a single attack, and having by far the most health up to this point in the game. He'll recover from stunning almost immediately, he's ridiculously fast, and he can spam his burst mode to not only quickly recover a lot of HP, but also buff up his stats to the moon. And this is before Judith joins the party, so you don't have a way to really clear those buffs out, you just have to hope he dies before you do. It's not fun, and it doesn't even make sense narratively for this boss fight to be such a big, crazy challenge. This isn't an in-game fight or a major antagonist, it's a robot that a random 2-bit villain sicks on you to make his escape, and then he gets murked by the actual villain not even a minute after this fight ends. Number 25, the Behemodyne. Okay, so we're out of the bad boss territory, and now we're into the it's okay territory. I don't have much to say about this boss if I'm being honest. It's a late game monster boss where you're locked to using Van, Judith, Agnes, and Elaine. He's just kind of here to help service the plot for Van and Elaine starting to properly make up with one another. Honestly, not much to say here. I do like his design quite a bit, but really, this is probably the most meh fight in the game. It's not winning any awards, but it's not giving any negative emotions either, so it gets above the bottom 4, which I actively hate, and we'll never fight on Nightmare mode again. And you know what, it is cool that we get to fight alongside Elaine, since it wouldn't be until next game where she became a permanent party member. And it does at least stand out among some of the monster bosses because he's actually one of them that's immune to instant death, so that's kind of funny and also kind of cool. Number 24, Elaine. So yeah, speaking of Elaine, this is not a boss fight, this is a cutscene disguised as a boss fight. Elaine has 20% of her HP at the start of the battle, and we'll get to use 2 or 3 moves before she goes down, even with Van flying solo. Also, I should mention now, I'm not counting all the different possible alignment battles you can face in Chapter 5, because that would require playing through this chapter 4 separate times, and while Chapter 5 may be my favorite in the game, that's just plain silly. I do like the pre-boss cutscene though. It's not domestic violence, it's domestic combat.
You are just so frustrating sometimes.
Took the words right out of my mouth, sweetheart.
Number 23, Viola. After all the random alignment battles, your first major boss in Chapter 5 is going to be against Viola, a character I personally hate. She's really just an evil sadist with a personality of, I had to suffer, so why shouldn't other people? And uses that as justification to be cruel to others and kill hundreds of thousands of innocent people. Actually, it's kind of funny. She's a character that had a wealthy upbringing but lost everything as a child and had horrible things happen to her, so in a way, she's a lot like Gisette, except where Gisette eventually got her life turned around and started her own company, Viola became a terrorist. See, a major theme of Trails Through Daybreak in particular is characters with similar upbringings and hardships going down very different paths based off a couple of key choices they made. Some rose above the adversity, becoming better people, wanting to help those less fortunate, while others spiraled further and further, becoming increasingly worse. I talk about this because, as a boss fight, she's okay, but she's not doing anything crazy. The problem is, she's an early game boss, and you can tell she's an early game boss. She's not really designed to work on her own like some of the others. She has a few ads that help her out, but they'll be dead in a minute or so. Otherwise, I mean, she uses her gun in various patterns like sweeping bullets, a more precise sniper shot, and firing into the air to make bullets rain down. You'd think her health would make her a threat, but she doesn't really have any tricks up her sleeve. She's kind of designed to work with other bosses, and when she's on her own, she's not tough at all. Out of all the members of Almada, while I may hate the Alexander fight more, Viola is honestly a much worse character, just being a generic bitter sadist lady, and we've already got a sadist villain in the game in the form of Melchior, who interacts with the party far more, and he's a lot more entertaining. Though, this is also the first boss in the game to have a significant story decision tied to it, because after the fight ends, Viola will point a gun at Agnes attempting to shoot her, so Van has to choose to either take the bullet and subdue her, or to straight up kill her. I may try to play the good guy in games with moral alignment systems, but this game doesn't do good, neutral, evil, it does law, gray, chaos. So, you know what? Chaos, bitch. Number 22, Grimcats. I normally hate the trend of a character with a super obvious secret identity, but in this game's case, I think it's fine because Van and Fairy almost instantly figure out her true identity, and it just becomes a bit of a running joke where they lampshade the crap out of it for the next couple of chapters. As for the fight itself, she has the makings of a really strong boss, with her having ranged attacks, a whirlwind that hits around her, an HP thief attack, and even a unique status effect known as Bewitched, which Lucrezia can also inflict that status effect, but she's in alignment battle and she's not getting counted on this list. She also spends this fight in permanent stealth mode, but that's really just a visual effect here, it doesn't have any impact on the boss fight. Overall, there's the makings of a really good boss battle, and her jazzy boss theme is one of the best tracks in the game, but sadly the fight gets interrupted early, and there's never really a proper run back where she gets a full-blown boss fight, so all the cool mechanics don't get fully realized. But hey, at least it's nice to have a boss that doesn't get nerfed into the ground when she becomes a party member later on in the game. Number 21, Roa Graim. So, fun fact, this boss's original Japanese name was Loa Graham. They changed it because Loa is a recurring antagonist in the Trails of Cold Steel saga, and the final boss of Cold Steel 1. An abyssal hell demon and a larger than average bird are not quite the same. Now, as for the boss itself, it's okay, but it suffers from an unfortunate case of this boss loving status effects way too much. You will be paralyzed, blinded, frozen, and more in this fight if you're not careful, and that's to say nothing about him being able to lower all your stats with a single attack, which can pretty quickly lead to a miserable fight if you're not keeping Agnes topped off at all times to use White Heal. Plus, I gotta be honest, around this point in the game, I was starting to get sick of the monster boss theme. This game has a healthy selection of 8 or so boss themes outside of the in-game, but this one is probably my least favorite simply because it sounds like it's trying to be two completely different songs, but in a way that doesn't really work in a looping boss theme that's only 2 minutes long. Also, like Oka, he can enter burst mode to recover HP and buff all his stats before Judith has joined the party, but he also only does it when at low health, and does it very rarely. Design-wise, the boss looks very awesome visually, but gameplay-wise, I'm not the biggest fan. Number 20, Walter and Sal. It is neat getting to fight Walter again, but sadly, we're still one more game away from him getting his own full-blown boss fight. Here, he's fighting alongside Sal, while you're being backed up by Zen. It is cool getting to have some legacy characters in your party for a boss battle, but sadly, it's only for this one fight, which feels like missed potential because later on, he does help you, but he's stuck as an AI party member for some reason. Anyways, the fight itself is really a cool set piece, but ends before it really gets going because both of them have low health and bail out when they reach half HP. Sadly, we'd have to wait until Trails Through Daybreak 2 for a proper rematch with Walt. Hey everybody, Future Christian here, interrupting this video so far to let you know that I've actually made this video already, but I didn't realize until later that basically all the footage for the remaining 2/3 of this video had become corrupted and unusable, so I had to not only redo a vast majority of the audio recording, but I had to just straight up go and re-record the remaining 19 boss fights. Now, a wiser man would have cut his losses and ended the project then and there, saying, well, I tried. But I'm not wise, I'm an idiot, so I went and redid all the fights all over again to collect their footage and continue from there. Just letting you know, most of the script is going to remain unchanged, but yeah, I just figured I'd mention that. Number 19, Verathragna. You know, I'm not really sure how I feel about this boss, to be honest. It's split into two phases, with your first battle being against Sheridan and Najee, after you already fought them. And it's probably the best fight against two characters gameplay-wise because they actually coordinate their attacks and work together, with Najee doing the physical attacks while Sharid sticks to the more support role with magic. And he has a diabolical attack where he can teleport you right in front of Najee, which she will follow up with a combo of her own, which is pretty cool. But it can also get pretty annoying because a lot of stuff that they do also inflicts paralyze on you, which is just annoying to deal with. It's not really making the fight much harder, it's just dragging the fight out more. I'm not sure how I feel about this part. Really, the strategy here is just bum rush Sharid and get him out of the way as fast as you can. Then, as for the big bad chapter boss itself, you're going to be facing off with Reuploaded right after, and despite being the first boss to have a 6-digit health bar, it's by far the easiest chapter boss in the game. The boss looks cool, but it's extremely easy thanks to this not only being the first chapter boss where you have a full party, but you also have another one in reserves, and you have Grimcat here to help out as well. There's no real danger in this boss fight either, if I'm being perfectly honest. Reuploaded can't do too much to Grendel mode, and you'd have to really be struggling to lose all your other party members at this point. I also have to question, why is Najee the one that turns into Reuploaded and not Prince Sharid? And also, why does she survive the battle after the fact when, spoilers, most of the other chapter bosses die when you beat them? It's weird. Chapter 3 is genuinely one of the highlights of the game for me. Probably my second favorite, only behind Chapter 5. But it's got by far the worst of the boss rosters, with the likes of Hydra Nubia and Razamber Oka. Thankfully, unlike those two, this one isn't a bad boss, but compared to the other chapter bosses, this one falls kind of flat. Though, after the hell that was the last two boss fights, I guess I should be thankful it ends on a pretty easy note, all things considered. Number 18, 100 Eyes. I'd say from this point onwards, I have some genuine positives to say about pretty much all the remaining bosses, which is pretty good in my book, considering we still have about 60% of the list left to go. Anyways, 100 Eyes is going to be the second boss players will face off against in this game, and your introduction to powerful monsters, which are, for the most part, going to become your side quest bosses going forward, and most of them will go unranked. However, as the first entry of the lot, and the one that's required to beat the game, 100 Eyes will get a spot on this list. He also gets some points for his pretty out there design and making good use of the game's new combat system, which heavily encourages attacking him from different angles, mainly from the side, instead of head on, in order to deal more damage and have a higher chance of hitting him. But also, just minding your positioning in general, because this boss likes to charge up different arts, which will usually fire off in a set location or go in a straight line like a beam. So you want to move out of the way and avoid getting hit. Or, this is where you'll want to use things like your attacks that inflict impede, which shut off their arts from going off, whichever you find more necessary at the time. Overall, 100 Eyes isn't doing anything super crazy, but for doing his job well enough as an early game fight, and as a respectable step up in difficulty for the second boss of the game, I think he deserves a bit of credit. It's also one of the many bosses in this game that is not immune to instant death and should 100% be abused whenever you're playing through on Nightmare mode. It's really funny. Number 17, Melchior and Olympia. You fight Olympia 3 times in this game, and you fight Melchior entirely too damn much in this game, but really, this battle is kind of meant to be your preview fight for what they have up their sleeves. Olympia is going to be playing mostly a support role, while Melchior mostly throws out his bombs. It's a preview fight just like Alexander and Viola, but the difference is, while I don't really like Alexander and Viola that much, I actually really like these two. So it gets a few extra points from me. Plus, I like the story implications at the end where they go to detonate the facility, and Rosette ends up having to throw herself in front of the blast to save Katra from getting killed, which she only survives because of her prosthetic limbs, which she doesn't really like. And it's a cool detail that if you actually look at her character design, you can see that those limbs are actually, well, you can see the seams in those limbs on her model. Number 16, Yako Nue. I actually really like the intermission chapter of this game. It's on the shorter end, but it's where I really came to appreciate the cast of characters, on top of having Judith join the party for real this time. Also, Brittany Cox single-handedly makes her character a lot better.
Oh, yes. And the only thing on my agenda for today is kicking your ass, you stupid primate!
Anyways, the Nue is a powerful foe, much stronger than basically any non-chapter boss you've faced up to this point in the game, but that's because it's designed to make sure you figured out the new mechanics, as you not only have a vastly expanded party, but you now have a Grendel shift, which allows Van to take control and essentially supercharge himself for 3 turns, turning into his Grendel form. And most of the game's remaining bosses, this will be an option, except like 3 for plot reasons. On top of that, the boss really likes to enter his burst mode, which raises all his stats and will heal his HP a little bit, which would be annoying, but he takes massive damage when stunned and from Grindel mode in general, on top of you now having Judith being a playable character with the handy dandy ability to instantly remove all buffs from an enemy. I like the boss a good deal, and actually it works well as more or less the game's last big teaching tool before it lets you loose with a non-stop boss bonanza in Chapter 5, and the pretty creepy design and just outright pretty arena. Yeah, it's a good fight. I remember it and I like it a lot. Number 15, Arioch First Encounter. So Arioch is kind of weird compared to the other antagonists in the game. You're guaranteed to fight him twice, but you could fight him potentially dozens of times. I'm only gonna be counting the 2 battles in this list though, as I think the first fight is cool but outclassed by his rematch, so we'll be talking about Battle 1 first. See, Chapter 5 is this big battle between 20 different teams in order to get to the end to stop the villains from setting off a nuclear bomb in a capital city. But they set it up so we're forced to do this Hunger Games style competition, and at the start of the chapter you'll be given a choice of different groups to side with, and if your alignment is high enough, you get far more options available. That's really cool, and yeah, as you can see, I sided with Ikaruga to get Shizuna and Kuragane on the party because the ninja group is just fun. Then, as far as the fight itself goes, it's really more of a simplified version of the final Arioch battle, but that's not necessarily bad because the way he works is he's this big aggressive brute that goes into an enraged mode constantly and also gets additional healing from it, but he's designed to be hard countered by Judith, which is pretty good incorporation of both gameplay and narrative coming together. And after you get done beating him, you're actually not free of him. See, the way it works is that he's going to be hunting the teams throughout the chapter, and he has a chance of randomly invading your area and coming to attack you, which helps sell the idea of him being this immortal monster that really just wants to screw with you.
The passengers will have the distinct honor of witnessing their homes, families, and friends explode before their very eyes. All they can do is watch helplessly from above as their former lives go up in flames. I can hardly imagine a more perfect gift of fear.
You're going to notice that with the exception of Erethragna, most of the chapter bosses in this game tend to hit pretty dang well, and Gerard the Completionist Dantes is the fight to cap off my personal favorite chapter of the game, Chapter 5. Don't be fooled by his middle of the list placement. I do like this fight a good bit, but because there is an objectively better version of this fight later in the game, that does hurt his placement somewhat. It is cool, however, getting a real boss fight against the main antagonist before the end of the game, even if he has way too much health on Nightmare mode, but on any other difficulty it's not too bad. I don't really want to talk about him too much. He's got a lot of cool attacks, he's got a lot of attacks that you'd be not expecting from a dude with just a giant sword, but it's a lot of fun. And I like the ending cutscene where Van chooses to take him out as a human instead of using his Grindel power.
Dare mock me? I was right all along. I found it. Seems my work here is now done.
Number 13, the Lagrantula. The not-so-itsy-bitsy spider is your first boss to kick off the game's intermission chapter. Not kidding, it's called the intermission. And it stands out among the regular boss monster counterparts thanks to it having 2 distinct phases, as well as being immune to instant death, and having an actually major boss theme instead of just the generic boss monster theme. Phase 1 is definitely the harder of the two, as you have to fight all the mini spiders with the web traps, making this a fight where you can get worn down, but you'll really want to go all out here, because if you let those spiders get too many actions, you'll get mobbed to death by the overwhelming swarm. But thankfully, this is Trails Through Daybreak. Everyone and their brother has some form of strong AoE or multi-target attack, allowing you to get creative and just plow through the enemies, and the boss itself relies heavily on charging up attacks. And that's where you'll want to reposition to avoid those, and that's also why you want the spiders to get taken out, so you have more room to move around. It's a creative boss, and I think the positioning check in an RPG where positioning actually matters is a good thing. The second phase of the fight is really more of your cathartic beatdown, where you get to absolutely tear into the Lagrangula, but getting to do so with a powered up Grendel form while the game's main theme plays is just cool, and I'm not immune to hype. I'm the dude that will lose my shit and point at the screen when a final boss fight or the big battle in an anime has the main theme song start playing during the fight. It's fun, it's decently challenging, and it lasts just long enough to feel cathartic without getting tedious. Number 12, Kuragane. Before you can get Shizuna to join your team, Kuragane requests a duel to test your strength, then proceeds to split it into 3, and yeah, he's using ninjutsu. This is going to be ranging from things like caltrops and wires to halt your movement, to his demon windmill shuriken he pulled out of Naruto, that can take some chunks out of your health, though it is kind of funny how his copies actually aren't immune to status effects like Bewitch from Judith or Instant Death. So you can kind of inflict those and cause some major shenanigans, which is pretty neat, and I like when bosses aren't completely immune to statuses. Overall, I don't really have as much to say about this fight as some of the others. I think it's just a well-designed fight, considering that it's kind of a optional minor boss, I guess you could say. And I like how it's executed with the ninja actually using his various techniques to fight you, and shows he's not just a passive agent in this story, because even when you beat him, he's going to fight alongside you to bring down Almada for the rest of the chapter, just like Shizuna does. And I think he makes a respectable addition to the team, even if he does get locked to level 56 for some reason.
You ask the impossible. I am a shinobi who lives in the shadows. You will simply have to adjust to me and my dear twin brothers. No. That was but a mere light-hearted jest.
Don't worry, guys. You'll get used to him and his sense of humor soon enough.
Number 11, Arioch Round 2. It's basically Arioch Round 1, but on crack. He's now got double the HP and a whole lot more damage output up his sleeve, on top of his Berserk mode buffing all his stats to insane degrees, and being able to basically one-shot party members if you're not keeping your shields up and being very careful at all times. This is a fight that is very hard, but remember, Van is allowed to enter Grendel mode for this battle, and he's not locked to fighting as just a regular dude, so transform to make your life easier. Otherwise, the deck will seem stacked against you at first, but I like how powerful his attacks look, and he's actually presented as this genuine threat, even if he is a much more straightforward character than some of the other antagonists. This is also a fight where your special effects are going to really come in handy because he's weak to those, so things like Coin Bullet can save your life because it will taunt him and draw aggro across the arena, so he'll likely gun it for Van instead of going after your healers. And he's also weak to a lot of the status effects other than Instant Death, which he's immune to. And you also want to be careful because his S-Craft can just about one-shot you if you're not actually paying attention. Either way, this fight is going to be hard as is expected from an immortal warrior, and I'd say, in a way, Arioch acts as the real gatekeeper to the final chapter because he's way harder than Dantes was, and since you don't have permanent Grendel mode here, you can't do any special cheesy shenanigans here. This is the boss where you can't afford to hold anything back, so instead throw everything in the kitchen sink at him if you don't want to die. He's tough, but given all the resources you have available, he still feels completely fair, unlike certain other bosses in the game, and that's why out of all the hard bosses, he's probably my second favorite of the bunch.
Change the world. My final message. Goodbye.
Number 10, Gargo Room. The tutorial boss of the game makes it into the top 10, and I think they do an honest-to-goodness respectable job for their main purpose. As mentioned before in my best first bosses video, these two emphasize how useful proper positioning can be, as well as utilizing other mechanics like the stun gauge and exploiting elemental weaknesses. On top of that, the surviving gargoyle will always enter in enraged mode when one of them goes down to give it a little extra difficulty, but at the same time this boss isn't immune to things like instant death, so if you want to be exploiting those alternate win conditions, that's an option here. Now, normally, the first boss being weak to instant death would be worthless advice for a new playthrough, but you get shadow spikes during the prologue and at the start of the game, and it stays useful throughout the entire game thanks to its respectable damage, fan-shaped attack radius, and the ability to proc instant death on any foe that's not outright immune to it, which means it works surprisingly well on fishing for insta-kills against any boss that can, well, be insta-killed by it. which is most of the quest bosses actually, and even some story bosses. Overall, I like this tutorial boss a lot. Good gargoyles in my book. Number 9, Shizuna. Shizuna is the boss fight to cap off the intermission of the game, and she's basically a super boss fight, but the game is nice enough to cut the battle off at half HP. I say this because one of the game's super bosses is just straight up a rematch with her at full HP, but there's no story to it, it's just an optional data battle sort of thing, so we're not counting it for this list. Shizuna, though, is an absolute beast in combat, being able to hit multiple targets at once using her various attacks, such as her Divine Blade skills and her Ice Arts, on top of being, as far as I know, the only boss in the entire game with a sure shot attack that will never miss the target. And it's just as broken when you can use it when playing as her. But overall, it's a very tough fight. You may only have to take her down to half health, but when she effectively has over 100,000 HP, she's not going to be going down easily or anytime soon. Really though, this fight kind of feels like a fully realized version of the Judith boss fight from much earlier in the game, with the emphasis on positioning to deal with the attacks that would otherwise be extremely tricky, and the idea of not wanting to stay clumped together or surround her too much because she has ways to take out being surrounded. On top of that, you're also not able to use Grendel mode in this fight for a story reason that isn't an arbitrary ass pull, which I appreciate. And it's also nice to have a boss that becomes a party member that doesn't get nerfed into the ground. Yes, she has significantly lower HP as a party member for the sake of obvious game balancing. Can't have someone with over 100,000 HP on the team, though that'd be hilarious. But she's just as strong, if not stronger, on your team than she is here, and she's already one of the toughest fights in the game. Number 8, Vagrant's Diaspora. The final boss of the game, and it's not bad? Well, okay, kind of. See, this boss has two very distinct phases, and I really like the final phase of the fight, but I kinda hate phase 1 of the fight. You've only got to get him to half HP in this phase, but with Van removed from the party, since we're kind of fighting the darkness within Van as he wants to sacrifice himself, standard Persona final boss BS, it's not really an option right now. See, the issue is a lot of final bosses in this series are against characters you actually interact with, so Temu Ishmelga over here feels pretty lame in comparison since we've already done that song and dance against an ancient demon, and Ishmelga was not only cooler in the final boss of the last game, and the game before that, he also had multiple games of build-up. This guy's got, like, not nearly as much. I mean, it's some stuff in the background, I guess. But gameplay-wise, the real reason this fight is so low. See, he has this move where he will target a party member, and when his next turn rolls around, he will banish them from the fight for the rest of the battle. Which kinda sucks when you only have a total of 7 party members, and you'd think, oh, that's not too bad, and yeah, sure, it's not too bad on normal difficulty, but on Nightmare mode, this fight is hell, because he is so tanky, and when your damage dealers keep getting banished, it just gets dragged out. And the only way to stop the banishment, as far as I know, is to stun him out of the attack, which is not guaranteed to happen because he has a pretty large stun meter. In fact, it's about the size of Massachusetts. It turns an otherwise warm-up phase into this really tedious ordeal that significantly brings down the battle as a whole for me, and I wish he didn't have that move. That one move kind of ruins the first half of the fight. But thankfully, they are able to bring things home with Phase 2, where Van is able to break free of the chains that bind him. I guess you could say they're fragile. And he can confront Vagrants himself. On paper, this second phase is harder as he's far more aggressive, but without the banish move and Van and the party now able to utilize Grendel form at command, it ends up being a challenging but pretty fun fight. While Vagrants doesn't have the ability to move around the arena, he doesn't fall into the same trappings as something like Hydra Nubia due to the circular design of the arena, which actually allows you to attack him from different angles, forcing you to still mind your positioning. This fight ends up being a pretty cinematic battle, giving me the same vibes as like Braska's final Aeon from Final Fantasy X, which is a good thing because I love Final Fantasy X. And having the main theme backing you up as the final boss track does add some pretty significant hype to the battle. Overall, Phase 2 is awesome. and it's a great final battle, but the annoyance of Phase 1 and his lack of character or detailed lore bring him down a good deal. That could very well be expanded upon in the future. I haven't played the most recent game, as it's still only been released in Japan right now, but overall, I think this guy would have been cooler as a secret final boss designed to tease the next game, but as far as I know, he's 100% required to beat the game's main story and see the credits run, because I think this game only has one ending. Number 7, Demon Melchior. Gotta be honest, Melchior is an awesome villain, and his voice actor really nails the whole homosexual sadomasochist shtick. That's one hell of a sentence right there. Ultimately, while Dantes might have been the one to nuke a city, Melchior was the one pushing all the pieces into place. Or, as he puts it,
I didn't merely draft the plan. I dotted the I's and crossed every T. Only I could have envisioned such a marvelously devious scheme. Much to my delight, that wonderful little village was a rare model of racial harmony as well. The boss was beside himself with joy when I told him of my plan. We had to deliver results to our investors, and we did so by wiping Cray off the map.
honestly, he nails it as a love-to-hate villain. But then he proceeds to kill himself because if you die in the game, you die in real life. Or I guess in this case, if you die in Pandemonium, you get brought back to life as a demon? Yeah, I think that's what it's supposed to be. Anyways, this fight initially seems similar to his earlier battles in the game, with him using his knife to cut up your party members, but you'll quickly realize he isn't going to be throwing out bombs like he does usually, and instead he's just creating a bunch of spectral clones to get in on the fight. They can be kind of annoying, but hey, it's just clones, right? We can always tear them apart with status effects like usual. Well, not quite. You see, when the clones get low on HP, they actually start kamikazing and blowing themselves up. The master of explosives has become the explosive himself, but they'll thankfully give us a warning as they start flashing when they're about to blow up and mark where the explosion is going to be. It's a tough fight, fitting of one of the game's final bosses. Well, actually it's the third to last fight in the game. And his boss theme is really awesome. In fact, it's a brand new song up to this point in the game that's a remix of the classic Enforcer boss theme from Trails in the Sky 2, which is a really cool throwback. While this boss doesn't exactly have phases, he has new AI scripts as he gets lower on HP, which I guess is kind of a phase change, and by the end of the fight, he'll be having multiple clones in the field that start prepping to blow themselves up immediately. In a lot of cases, an RPG boss against an antagonist will be judged mostly by how well they work in the narrative, but having a neat mechanical shakeup always gives the fight a few bonus points so long as the mechanic isn't annoying. Overall, I think this is a great send-off to an awesome villain. Number 6, Assault Frame Zychris. When I understood the weakness of my flesh, I felt disgusted. Or something like that. Most chapter bosses are against these primeval monsters or people that have been mutated into nightmarish abominations, but Chapter 4 caps things off with a battle against a giant mech designed specifically for combat. For context, 2 years prior to the events of this game, there was a great war that engulfed the continent where the invading army had mechs known as Panzersoldats. The war was able to be ended early thanks to the heroes of the Trail of Cold Steel 4, but the damage was still done, and now Calvert has created mechs of their own to counter those, including the Zychris, which is meant to be more of a remote-controlled model. However, this model is not exactly remote-controlled, it's being controlled by, well, Professor Callahan. This boss actually fights in a way similar to the final boss of Trails in the Sky 1, relying heavily on beam energy attacks, but also using attacks like Flare Canceller that do low damage but stop any arts that you're currently using, which means slow cast nukes are not on the table, unless you can use things like Overclock to boost your speed, and it's another multi-phase boss fight with its trend. Basically all the remaining bosses are multi-phase actually, where you're going to be fighting phase 1 as your regular form, and then phase 2 he's going to get some sort of boost. And, well, you'll usually get a Grindel form. In this case, his stats don't really change too much outside of his speed being cranked up to 11, where he's going to be getting actions almost constantly, which can turn a potentially easy fight into a potentially pretty hard one. Overall though, I still wouldn't call Phase 2 that hard when you know what you're doing, but he doesn't roll over and die, which I respect, and Callahan just has an awesome voice. The English voice cast for this game in general do a great job overall, and the finisher is really cool since we actually get to kill this guy. Number 5, Ida. We're back to the early game, and Ida is a really awesome boss fight, in my opinion. You're extremely outnumbered with only Van, Agnes, and Fairy fighting her entire squadron of soldiers that come in two varieties of sword wielders and gunners. The sword wielders have to get up close to you to attack, but they can deal a ton of damage for the early game, while the gunners can take pot shots at you from range. Ida, meanwhile, is kind of the commander unit that they'll all form around during the fight, and she's going to be doing things like healing her team up and giving them buffs on top of just attacking on her own. And this battle is where you'll have to decide if you want to use your stronger single strike attacks or go for more area of effect attacks, as well as the different directions you can attack enemies from, and also bonus effects such as Fairy being able to inflict slow. I like the mechanics here a lot, and I think Fairy ends up being a good addition to the team with moves like Heat Edge that can pierce through lines of enemies, as well as light them on fire. Strafe, which hits multiple enemies clumped together and slows down their speed, giving you more time to breathe. And Chant of Flame, which is one of the best buffs in the entire game hands down. It's weird to say since this is technically a turn-based RPG, but I genuinely consider this to be a really well done gank boss, with you putting all the mechanics you've learned throughout the early game to the test, and because it's a chapter in boss, there's a Phase 2 where we get a Grendel battle. Thanks to the actions of Melchior and the Genesis, we get to see Ida mutated into this abomination that looks pretty creepy, all things considered. Having Van and Fairy working together to bring down this foe is a lot of fun because it's your first Grendel battle with a teammate, and the opponent doesn't just get bursted down by the overwhelming might of the Grendel. In fact, you actually need to be very mindful of both teammates here because Ida can easily outlast Van if you're playing on normal or higher, so the Fairy is going to be coming in clutch here since she's able to use items and heal him on top of all her bonus effects like Chant of Flame to buff up, Heat Edge to burn Ida, and, Strafe to slow her down. Which, Strafe doesn't really do a ton of damage, but hey, when a big scary monster gets less turns, that's a good thing. I love this fight, and I think it does a good job setting that Trails Through Daybreak is going to be a very different game from the other ones, and a much darker game on top of that, because some of the previous entries, like the entire Trails of Cold Steel series, was somewhat infamous for refusing to let characters die or stay dead. I'm not even kidding when I say I think more characters die in this game than the entire Erebonia arc, which was 5 games long. Number 4, The Tyrant. Moving on to Chapter 2, we have ourselves another good chapter in boss now with Aaron after he played too much Yakuza 0. Ida wasn't easy by any means, but she could be pretty reliably beaten as long as you could keep Barry alive, which wasn't too hard to do if you were paying attention. This is the first boss that might be a match for Grendel mode, as he's able to create clones of himself to increase his number of attacks per turn, while having more moves up his sleeve like Cataclysmic Meteor that don't really hurt Van but do a lot of damage to Agnes and Fairy, which is where the challenge comes in. Tyrant knows how to play the resource game, and if he can cut off your healing supply, he can outlast Grendel pretty handedly, even with you having a brand new S-Craft for Grendel mode, which does a ton of damage. Though what's interesting is that when you defeat the clones, they don't disappear and instead remain in the arena, and you can actually use their bodies as shields to block him off if you want. It's pretty funny, and it also leads to a somewhat goofy animation of seeing him scurrying around the arena. I feel like maybe they should have just had him float or something, but oh well. But as to be expected for a chapter boss, there is a second phase at the end of this battle, and unlike the other ones, it's not a Grendel fight, instead it's a 1v1. The second phase is going to be Aaron 1v1ing Tyrant on his own, taking place inside his mind with this really cool arena going on in the background. And if this boss came out a game later, you know very well this fight would have become an action mode battle, which would have been awesome, but sadly they weren't quite confident in their ability to do that yet. So this phase is more visual and story focused, but it's still a lot of fun, and it's where you get to hear Satisfied Madness, which is my personal favorite of the regular boss themes, for the first time. The fight is by no means free though, because while on normal mode it's a cakewalk, a hard mode will require you to use Aaron and everything he's capable of, and on Nightmare mode, this might just be the hardest boss in the entire game, or at least it was for me, because I remember this fight alone taking me about 17 attempts or something like that. Good challenge, great music, awesome visuals, strong story beats. This is by far the best of the early game bosses, and you get an awesome party member for beating it. Number 3, Olympia and Ishtanti. So, these could be considered two separate bosses, but I'm combining the boss fights against them together because Ishtanti is less of her own fight and more like an optional super boss that acts as an optional phase 2 of the fight. You can also probably guess from that statement why this boss fight stands out so much to me, because this sort of stuff is just cool, and I appreciate when a choice-based game actually gives my choices some impact, and this is potentially the largest impact in the entire game. But first, we need to beat Olympia, and what's interesting is the fact that she uses Ishtanti to fight you, but she doesn't really move around the arena herself, so you can hit her from pretty much anywhere on the map, and the mooks she summons in are just kind of there as a little bit of extra backup. It's nothing crazy, but there's an interesting dynamic going on here that's definitely better than Viola or Alexander's boss fights earlier in this chapter, and it stands out a bit because, you know, it's neat. Olympia also stands out from the other villains because she isn't really evil like the others, but she's extremely mentally ill, and that's because the Ishtanti was suppressing her emotions and her morals because as a child, she basically had to cut a Faustian bargain trying to cope with her parents being murdered right in front of her, and her village attempting to use her as a cult sacrifice. After Ishtanti cracks, that seal is undone and the gravity of all her actions hit her like a truck, and what's the first thing she tries to do to atone for it? Take her own life. At this point, you are given two options. You can either let her succeed in ending it herself, or you can choose to stop Ishtanti and you'll be able to save Olympia, but you get a second phase of the boss fight, which is kind of this game's super boss that is unlocked behind all the alignment stuff that's super easy to miss. Now, Ishtanti has all the same attacks Olympia had, but now with a much higher speed and aggression on top of happily moving around the entire arena, requiring you to adapt on the fly, and she's got a full-blown divine arsenal of attacks, such as Gate of El Dorado and her very own S-Craft. This fight is pure spectacle. But it's also really fun, and depending on your actions, you'll get two different cutscenes. And while I don't think every antagonist needs to be a feel bad for me, I have depressing backstory, it does make sense that Rosette would be able to empathize with Olympia due to similar enough challenges, and Rosette just straight up tells her, "You're alive, figure it out, find a way to atone for your actions." Though, I doubt we'll ever see her again because while you can transfer your save data from this game to the sequel, having a character that either could be alive or not, it's generally easier to go ahead than assume they're dead, or like add in one line of dialogue as a throwaway saying they're in a hospital or something. Still, it's a great fight. It's honestly my personal favorite boss of Chapter 5, and hey, Chapter 5 is my favorite chapter in the game, so it's getting a lot of points there. Number 2, Amdo Gilius. At the start of this game's final chapter, you're doing your obligatory early dungeon crawling, and you're going to see, okay, well, what kind of monster boss are we coming across this time? And then, surprise, we have an archdemon that crawled straight out of hell kicking off the events of the endgame. At first glance, this is a cool looking boss that just seems like a glass cannon because his HP is extremely low, but he does hit hard. But once you get his health to 0, the fight's not over because Elaine and Beauregard are going to show up to help you, and it's time for a 4-phase boss fight. See, as the battle goes on, Amdo Gilius will actually be bringing in minor demons along with him, and you have to fight them off, such as the Voldemivia, which is going to opt more for buffing its speed and utilizing various elemental attacks, though ultimately being pretty easy to bring down. Meanwhile, your other team is going to be facing off against the Gabrion, which seems simpler, and in a way it kind of is, but at the same time, it's bulkier and it goes more for the Unga Bunga strategy, which has been proven to be a pretty effective strategy when the boss actually has the stats for it. Then we get to the final phase where you have to bring down Amdo Gilius again, and supposedly you need to take him out quickly before more demons flood in, but as far as I can tell, this is really just a burst phase where he's been fully healed, but his health bar is pretty low, and your party is locked to whomever's left, which will be Van, Kincaid, Elaine, and one other member. Overall, it's a really fun fight that kicks off the game's final chapter and sets the tone well that if this demon from hell just popped up without any warning, then very bad things are sure enough going to be happening, and like clockwork, a few hours later pandemonium is kicked off. It's a fun boss with an awesome design, and while its importance in the story is minimal, it has some relevance to the series as a whole, being one of the 77 archdemons that has been a present threat throughout the entire series. So, I appreciate that it's kind of a cool lore boss as well.
I should thank you for the long-winded exposition, Dantes. Say, have you ever considered a career in film? You'd make a half-decent narrator. You're letting those badass vocal cords go to waste. Why don't you ditch this Mafia gig and shoot for a big debut on the big screen? I'll even set you up with Gotti. Who knows? Maybe you'll land yourself a starring role in a sexy romance flick with Judith.
Oh, hell no!
And with probably my favorite line in the game, it's time to talk about the guy who really should have been the final boss. Now, the fight against Dantes proper is another two-phase battle, obviously, but Phase 1 is an enhanced version of his battle from Chapter 5, with him sharing a lot of his moveset from that fight, but now starting to unleash the powers of hell as he's become a demon as well. On top of that, he's packing all the dangerous in-game skills like Plutus Nova, and you no longer have Shizuna and Kurogane to help you out, or permanent Grindel mode, so this fight's going to be tough, but thankfully, Dantes doesn't do any major healing BS to worry about, so while this phase is hard, you can still power through it, and this fight feels like a true no gimmicks in-game challenge and your last straight up fight without any tricks, and reminding you that bosses have things like counterattacks if you get too crazy. And hey, dude, also gets a few cool factor points because while Melchior may interact with the party more, Dantes does still have a presence throughout the story and is a genuine threat, as he is the one who ultimately nukes an entire town off the map that you went to earlier in the game, and was the one who sat in the middle of the blast radius like, yeah, I'll probably die, but hey, I might not, and that'd be pretty cool. And then he doesn't. So yeah, dude's getting a few cool points. And every NPC you interacted with there was probably killed. And once you get down with Phase 1, you get to Phase 2.
Well then, Van. Will you wake from your dream? Or not? Just what is she saying?
I will. I'll wake up.
Van, no! You can't!
These fragile chains guide me to this realm, where I am now made manifest. I am both the nightmare and the beast that devours it!
Unmitigated Evil is another 10 out of 10 boss theme, more than fitting to cap off our final battle with this game's main antagonist, though it's not exactly Dante's boss theme, it's Van's. Anyone else reminded of Veteran Odyssey 3's boss theme? Anyways, Dantes carries over all his moves from the previous two fights, but further builds off of it by drawing upon more and more powers of hell and sending your ass to the eyeball dimension, on top of having a special trap move that he can do where he can seal a party member away and you need to break them out before they get instantly killed. Be careful though, because breaking them out doesn't stop them from taking damage, so the answer really is just do a basic attack, but it's still a neat little shakeup. The fight is tough, and on Nightmare mode, barring any terrible luck with the Tyrant, would probably take the spot as the hardest boss in the game, but it doesn't really get in the way. It's a fair and fun sort of hard, at least in my opinion. The story is fantastic, we're fighting an actually well-written and threatening villain, the music is amazing, the arena is gorgeous. You know what? Screw it. This boss fight has some damn
Good atmosphere.
Plus, there was even a really funny glitch where upon launch, sorry, he wasn't immune to instant death, so you could get a quick kill against him with something like Plutus Nova. They've since patched it out, but I've got the footage to prove it in my old video showing off this fight. The only thing that would have made this fight better would have been if it incorporated the action combat into this battle, but sadly we'd have to wait until Daybreak 2 for a boss to actually attempt that. And while I haven't gone too crazy with the narrative, I love the somber mood underlying the entire final dungeon, as Van knows he's going to have to wake up from the dream, so to speak, and say farewell to this life he's made for himself and everyone he's cared about fully, expecting that his final conversation with Elaine at the start of this dungeon would be the last time he'd ever see her. And while they had started patching things up, things weren't exactly ending on the best of notes. And this fight is about as good as you can make a turn-based RPG boss, and barring that one last fight against the Vagrants, I think this acts as an excellent send-off to one of the best games I've ever played. And that's all for this video. I have no clue why I thought this long-ass video was a good idea. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is my longest boss ranking yet. And I especially have no idea why I decided to stick with it after the footage got super corrupted and I had to basically re-record and revoice over 70% of the video, God help me. But you know what? I did it because I love this game and wanted to talk about it in some way, shape, or form, but I don't exactly have the time or storage to record a full 100-hour game and make a video about it, so boss ranking it is, since not exactly hot competition for this one. And, you know what, I'm a firm believer of make the type of content you want to see on YouTube, and while I will always love my Dark Souls games and my big crazy Atlas RPGs, I'm always going to have a soft spot for Falcom games. They create some super high quality and creative experiences they put out despite the lower budgets they're constrained with. And while the Trails series is a long-running franchise with a continuous story, you'd be surprised how easy of a jumping in point Daybreak can be, as the game works perfectly fine standalone, but you will appreciate it far more if you've played the older games first. Thankfully, that won't be a concern too much longer, as Trails in the Sky 1 is getting a full-blown remake, and if they make the refinements and improvements that these later games have brought in and implement that well into this game, we may have a massive hit on our hands, and you may have a future boss ranking video coming out. I don't know, we'll have to wait and see. I'm always going to be more of a Ys fan, but I appreciate this series, and I love this game. It's easily my favorite of the, what are we at, 13 or 14 games in the series. I've played like 9 of them. No wonder it's intimidating to get into, honestly, since most of them hadn't even been localized since 2022, or at least prior to 2022. I'm rambling at this point. But that's all I've got for this video. If you enjoyed and you want to see more content of varying quality, consider liking and subscribing. I've made a couple boss rankings on the Ys series and plenty of other games, as well as Dark Souls 3 and Kirby. And if you want to see videos covering games as a whole, consider checking those out as well. I recently finished my Dark Souls 3 video, and I'm pretty proud of how it turned out. And also, this script was over 16 pages long, and yeah, this is actually my longest boss ranking to date. God help me. That's all I've got for now. Take care, everyone.